April 8, 1945. The morning mist rolled across the Atlantic as the Liberty ship SS Thomas H. Barry cut through gray waters toward New York Harbor. Below deck, 372 German prisoners of war stood in silence, their gaunt faces pressed against the narrow portholes. They had surrendered in North Africa, in Italy, in France. They had watched their Reich crumble beneath Allied bombs and witnessed the disintegration of armies that once seemed invincible. Now they were being transported to America, a land they had been taught to fear, a country their propaganda had painted as a nation of gangsters and plutocrats ruled by Jews and capitalists who would show no mercy to captured soldiers of the Third Reich. Unteroffizier Klaus Hartman stood among them, his uniform still bearing the dust of Tunisia. He was 23 years old, but looked 40. The last 2 years had carved deep lines into his face, lines born from sandstorms in the Sahara, from the thunder of British artillery at El Alamein, from watching friends die in the desert sun. He had expected execution, perhaps, or at least the kind of brutal treatment that German newsreels had promised awaited any soldier unlucky enough to fall into enemy hands. Instead, he had received medical attention, decent food, and treatment that bordered on respect. But America itself remained a mystery, a place of contradictions that existed somewhere between Nazi propaganda and the whispered stories of prisoners who had been there before. The ship's engine slowed as they approached the harbor. Through the porthole, Hartman caught his first glimpse of the Statue of Liberty rising from the water like a copper ghost. He had seen photographs of it in school, always presented as a symbol of false promises and capitalist hypocrisy. But seeing it now, massive and real against the morning sky, he felt something unexpected stir in his chest. It was not hope exactly. Hope was a luxury he had learned to abandon in the desert, but rather a strange curiosity about what lay ahead. The prisoners were processed at Camp Shanks in New York, a sprawling facility that had once served as a staging area for troops heading to Europe. American MPs guided them through medical examinations, delousing stations, and administrative procedures with an efficiency that surprised them. There was no violence, no degradation, no screaming officers demanding they crawl through mud or perform meaningless tasks designed to break their spirits. The Americans were businesslike, almost indifferent, treating them as one might treat cargo that needed to be inventoried and stored. This alone was revolutionary to men who had spent years in a military culture built on humiliation and dominance. From Camp Shanks, they were loaded onto trains, not cattle cars like those that had transported prisoners across Germany, but actual passenger cars with seats and windows. The journey took them through landscapes that seemed impossible. Hartman pressed his face against the glass as they rolled through Pennsylvania, watching farms that showed no signs of war damage, towns where lights blazed without fear of bombers, factories that churned out goods with smokestacks reaching toward a peaceful sky. This was supposed to be a nation at war, yet there were no ruins here, no bomb craters, no hollow-eyed civilians digging through rubble. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "It's not real," muttered Gefreiter Hans Weber, sitting beside him. Weber had been a schoolteacher in Hamburg before the war, a quiet man who spoke little but observed everything. "It's a show. They're driving us through undamaged areas to break our morale." But as the hours turned to days, as the train rolled through state after state, the same pattern repeated. Abundance, normalcy, a country untouched by the devastation that had consumed Europe. Hartman began to understand that this was not a show. This was simply America, a nation so vast and so protected by geography that the war remained an abstraction to most of its citizens. The realization was both humbling and infuriating. They arrived at Camp Concordia in Kansas on a warm spring afternoon. The camp spread across hundreds of acres of flat prairie, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. As the prisoners filed off the train, American soldiers watched them with expressions that ranged from boredom to mild curiosity. There was no hatred in those faces, no desire for revenge. To these guards, the Germans were simply another group of prisoners to be processed, fed, and housed until the war ended and arrangements could be made to send them home. The camp commander, Colonel Richard T. Harrison, addressed them through an interpreter. He was a tall man with graying hair and a stern but not unkind face. His words were formal but clear. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would work, as all prisoners were required to do, but they would be paid for their labor. They would receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Any man who attempted escape would be punished, but short of that, they would be treated as soldiers who had simply lost a war, not as criminals or monsters. Hartman and the others were assigned to Barracks 14, a long wooden structure that would house 40 men. As they entered, carrying the few possessions they had been allowed to keep, they stopped in collective amazement. The barracks were clean, genuinely clean, not the performative cleanliness demanded by officers in the Wehrmacht, but the kind of cleanliness that suggested someone actually cared about hygiene. Each man had his own cot with a real mattress, not a straw pallet, but an actual stuffed mattress with sheets and a wool blanket. There were windows that opened, allowing fresh air to circulate. The floor was swept. The walls were whitewashed. At the far end stood a potbelly stove for heat, and beside it, shelves for personal belongings. "This is better than our quarters in the Afrika Korps," someone whispered. It was true. Many of them had spent months sleeping in foxholes, in bombed-out buildings, in tents that offered no protection from the elements. Even when they had been stationed at proper bases in Germany, overcrowding and supply shortages meant that comfort was always sacrificed for functionality. But here, in an enemy prison camped thousands of miles from home, they were being housed better than they had been by their own army. The first meal arrived an hour later. American soldiers wheeled in carts loaded with metal trays, and the prisoners lined up with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to military routine. What they received made several of them stare in disbelief. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, and coffee. Real coffee, not the acorn substitute they had choked down in Germany. For dessert, there was apple pie. Hartman sat on his cot with the tray balanced on his knees, staring at the food. He had not seen this much meat in a single meal since before the war. In the Afrika Korps, rations had been monotonous and barely sufficient. Canned sardines, hard biscuits, weak ersatz coffee. After his capture, rations in the British POW camps had been marginally better, but still meager. This was a feast. "They're fattening us up," Weber said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. He was already eating, tearing into the chicken with his fingers, because it had been so long since he had seen meat that required effort to consume. Around the barracks, the same scene repeated. Grown men eating in silence, some with tears running down their faces, others laughing in disbelief. One prisoner, a young private named Otto Schneider, who had lied about his age to join the army at 16, simply sat and stared at his tray for 10 minutes before eating. When asked later why he had hesitated, he said he had been trying to memorize every detail because he knew that if he ever told anyone about this back home, they would never believe him. The abundance was not limited to that first meal. Every day, 3 times a day, the prisoners received more food than most of them had seen in years. Breakfasts brought eggs, bacon, pancakes, and fresh fruit. Lunches offered sandwiches made with real meat, soup, and vegetables. Dinners featured roasts, stews, casseroles, and always some form of dessert, pie, cake, pudding, ice cream. The Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of everything. Within 2 weeks, physical changes became visible. The hollowness in their faces began to fill out. The grayish pallor of malnutrition was replaced by a healthier color. Men who had arrived barely able to stand started regaining strength. The camp's medical officer, Captain David Weinstein, conducted examinations and found cases of scurvy, rickets, and advanced malnutrition among the new arrivals. He treated them with vitamin supplements, proper food, and rest, shaking his head at what years of German military logistics had done to these men. But the physical comfort was only part of the shock. The Americans provided them with recreation facilities that seemed absurd in a prison camp. There was a library stocked with books in German, including classics by Goethe, Schiller, and Thomas Mann that had been banned in Germany itself. There was a sports field where they could play football and handball. There was even a small theater where prisoners with musical or theatrical talent could organize performances. The Americans provided instruments, sheet music, and materials for building sets. Hartman, who had played violin before the war, found himself part of an impromptu orchestra that met 3 times a week. Sitting in the barracks on a spring evening, playing Mozart while the sun set over the Kansas prairie, he experienced a surreal disconnection from reality. He was a prisoner of war, thousands of miles from home, yet he was playing music, eating well, and sleeping in comfort while his countrymen back in Germany were starving, being bombed, and facing the Soviet advance. The guilt was crushing, but so was the relief. The work assignments began after the first week. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners work, and the Americans needed labor for the massive agricultural operations that fed both the civilian population and the war effort. The prisoners were divided into work details and transported each day to farms, canneries, and processing plants throughout Kansas and neighboring states. They harvested wheat, picked vegetables, processed meat, and performed 100 other tasks that kept America's food supply flowing. The work was hard, especially for men who were still recovering from months of malnutrition, but it was not cruel. They worked 8-hour days, not the crushing 12 or 14-hour shifts common in German labor camps. They were given breaks for water and rest. Farmers who employed them often provided lunch, and many of these farmers treated them with a casual friendliness that bewildered the prisoners. These were enemy soldiers, yet American farmers joked with them, taught them English phrases, and sometimes invited them to share meals with farmhands. Oberleutnant Friedrich Müller, who had commanded a panzer company in Italy before his capture, found himself working at a farm owned by a man named Henry Schmidt, whose parents had immigrated from Bavaria in the 1890s. Schmidt spoke fluent German and treated Müller with a strange mixture of formality and warmth. On their 3rd day working together, Schmidt asked Müller about his experiences in the war. Müller, cautious at first, slowly opened up, describing the chaos of the Italian campaign, the hopelessness they had felt as American armor overwhelmed their positions, the relief of surrender. Schmidt listened, then said something that stayed with Müller for the rest of his life. "My son is over there, fighting in Germany right now. I hope that if he ever becomes a prisoner, someone treats him the way I'm treating you." The statement contained no accusation, no anger, just a simple expression of shared humanity that cut through all the propaganda and ideology that had defined the war. Müller found himself unable to respond. He simply nodded and returned to work, but something had shifted in him. The enemy was no longer an abstraction. These were people with sons and daughters, people who valued life and hoped for peace, people who were capable of extraordinary kindness even toward those who had fought to destroy them. Not all interactions were so profound, but patterns emerged. American soldiers guarding the camps ranged from indifferent to friendly. Some shared cigarettes with the prisoners, others taught them baseball, a sport most Germans found utterly confusing. One guard, a sergeant named Michael O'Reilly from Boston, organized weekly baseball games between different barracks, complete with improvised equipment and increasingly elaborate rules that the Germans never quite understood but enjoyed anyway. The cultural differences were vast and sometimes comic. Germans, raised in a culture that valued order, precision, and hierarchy, struggled to comprehend the casual informality of American military culture. American soldiers called officers by their first names when off duty, complained openly about assignments, and seemed to have no respect for rank outside of official duties. This informality extended to the prisoners. Guards would strike up conversations, ask about Germany, share stories about their own lives. The rigid barrier between captor and captive that the Germans expected simply did not exist in the same way. But beneath the surface comfort and the kindness, there were undercurrents of complexity. News from Europe filtered into the camps through newspapers and radio broadcasts. In April 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Berlin. The newsreels shown in the camp theater, Americans showed films regularly as part of their recreation program, included footage of liberated concentration camps. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. Images of skeletal prisoners, mass graves, gas chambers designed for industrial murder. The barracks fell silent after those screenings. Many prisoners insisted it was propaganda, that the footage had been fabricated to justify the war. But others, particularly those who had witnessed SS operations in the East or had heard rumors from soldiers transferred from Poland and Russia, knew it was real. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable for some. How could they reconcile the care and humanity shown to them by their captors with the industrial brutality their own nation had perpetrated? Hartman lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. He had never been a fervent Nazi. He had joined the army because it was expected, because his friends were joining, because avoiding service was impossible. He had fought because that was what soldiers did, not because he believed in Hitler's vision for Europe. But he had fought nonetheless. He had fired his weapon at British soldiers in Africa, had called in artillery strikes that killed men he never saw. Was he complicit in what the newsreels showed? Could he claim ignorance when whispers of atrocities had circulated through the ranks for years? These questions were not unique to him. In barracks throughout Camp Concordia and hundreds of other POW camps across America, German prisoners grappled with the same moral crisis. Some retreated into denial, clinging to Nazi ideology even as evidence of its evil mounted. Others experienced a profound disillusionment, a collapse of the worldview that had sustained them through years of war. And many simply buried the questions, focusing on survival and the hope of eventual return home. The camp administration was aware of these tensions. American intelligence officers conducted interviews, trying to identify hardcore Nazis who might cause trouble and moderate prisoners who might be useful after the war ended. The denazification process had already begun, though in the informal way that characterized much of American policy. Prisoners were encouraged to read democratic literature, to attend lectures on American government and values, to engage with ideas that had been forbidden in Germany. Some embraced these opportunities eagerly. Others resisted, seeing it as enemy propaganda. Most fell somewhere in between, listening with skepticism but also with curiosity. As spring turned to summer, life in the camp settled into routine. The initial shock of comfort faded, replaced by a strange normalcy. Men formed friendships, pursued hobbies, wrote letters home that were censored but generally delivered. They learned English, played music, organized sports leagues, and built small communities within the barbed wire. The work continued, the food remained abundant, and the treatment stayed humane. But the psychological impact of this experience was profound and lasting. These men had been raised in a society that taught them democracy was weak, that Americans were soft and decadent, that Germanic culture was superior in every way. Yet here they were, defeated soldiers in an enemy prison camp, living better than they had in their own army, treated with more dignity than they had ever shown to prisoners they had taken. The contradiction could not be ignored or explained away. Gefreiter Weber, the former schoolteacher, spent hours in the camp library, reading books that had been banned in Germany for over a decade. He read Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which the Nazis had burned. He read Thomas Mann's essays on democracy and humanism. He read translations of American writers, Steinbeck, Hemingway, Mark Twain. The more he read, the more he understood how much had been hidden from him, how thoroughly the Nazi regime had controlled information and shaped perception. One evening, sitting outside the barracks as fireflies danced in the warm air, Weber said to Hartman, "We were lied to about everything. Not just propaganda about the war, but everything. The nature of government, the value of human life, the purpose of society. They built a prison inside our minds, and we didn't even know we were trapped." Hartman, who had been carving a piece of wood into a small figurine, looked up. "Does it matter now? The war is almost over. Germany is destroyed. Knowing we were deceived doesn't change what happened." "It changes what happens next," Weber replied. "When we go home, we'll have to rebuild. The question is what we build. Do we pretend the lies were truth, or do we try to create something different?" The conversation was interrupted by the sound of bells ringing from the camp's central square. News had arrived. May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. American soldiers cheered, threw their caps in the air, embraced each other. In the prisoner barracks, the response was more muted. Relief mixed with grief. Hope tangled with uncertainty. They were no longer fighting, but they were also no longer soldiers of a nation that existed. Germany had been divided among the victors. The future was entirely unclear. Colonel Harrison addressed the camp that evening. Through interpreters, He told them that they would remain prisoners until arrangements could be made for repatriation, but that process might take months or even years. Germany was in ruins, transportation was chaotic, and the Allies needed to prioritize rebuilding before they could send millions of prisoners home. In the meantime, life in the camp would continue as it had. Work, food, recreation, and humane treatment. For some prisoners, this news brought despair. They wanted to go home, to find out if their families had survived, to see what remained of their cities and towns. For others, particularly those from areas now under Soviet control, the prospect of staying in America was almost preferable to returning to an uncertain fate under Stalin's rule. The camp divided into factions, those desperate to leave, and those increasingly reluctant to return. As summer progressed, some prisoners were indeed repatriated, particularly those deemed least likely to have been involved with Nazi war crimes and most useful for rebuilding efforts. But the majority remained, and Camp Concordia became less a prison and more a peculiar community of displaced men existing in a strange limbo between war and peace. The work program expanded. Prisoners were now employed in construction, in forestry, in manufacturing. The pay they earned, nominal by American standards but significant to them, was deposited in accounts that would be given to them upon repatriation. Some prisoners saved every penny, planning for their return home. Others spent their wages on small luxuries available in the camp canteen: chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper. Hartman found work at a furniture factory in a nearby town, where he discovered a talent for woodworking that had been dormant since his childhood. The factory owner, a man named Arthur Green, treated him and the other German workers like regular employees, teaching them advanced techniques and trusting them with increasingly complex projects. Green never mentioned the war, never asked about their experiences, simply treated them as craftsmen doing a job. This normalcy, this return to productive work unconnected to military violence, was healing in ways that medical treatment could never achieve. One afternoon, Green pulled Hartman aside and showed him a photograph of a young man in an American uniform. "My nephew," Green said, "killed in France last year, 20 years old." He was silent for a moment, then continued, "I don't hold it against you. War is bigger than any of us. But I wanted you to know that this war had a cost, even here, even in places that were never bombed." Hartman nodded, unable to speak. The weight of that shared grief, the acknowledgement of loss on both sides, was almost too much to bear. He worked the rest of the day in silence, his hands moving automatically while his mind churned with emotions he had no words to express. The cultural education continued, both officially and unofficially. The camp showed American films, not just newsreels but Hollywood entertainment. The prisoners watched westerns, comedies, musicals, and dramas, gaining insight into American culture through its popular mythology. They were fascinated by the informality, the humor, the optimism that characterized American cinema even in wartime. It was so different from the heavy, propaganda-laden films that had been produced in Germany. Some prisoners developed a particular fascination with jazz, the music that Nazi propaganda had condemned as degenerate. American guards played records on portable phonographs, and gradually, German ears that had been trained to appreciate only classical and military music discovered the improvisational freedom of Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Benny Goodman. For young prisoners especially, jazz represented a kind of liberation, music that broke rules, that celebrated individual expression, that could not be regimented or controlled. As 1945 turned to 1946, the camp population began to decline as repatriation slowly accelerated. But the process was selective and often arbitrary. Men from Western Germany were given priority, while those from areas under Soviet occupation faced an uncertain future. The camp's character changed as the hardcore Nazis and most ardent patriots were shipped out first, leaving behind a population of moderates and those with nowhere to return to. Hartman received his repatriation orders in February 1946. He was to be returned to the British zone of occupation, where his hometown had been assigned to Allied control. The news brought mixed feelings. He wanted desperately to see his mother, to find out if his younger sister had survived the bombing campaigns, to walk on German soil again. But he was also terrified of what he would find. Every letter from home had described increasing devastation. Cities in ruins, food scarce, the population struggling to survive amid the rubble. His last week in Camp Concordia was filled with strange farewells. He said goodbye to Weber, who was staying behind because his hometown of Hamburg was still being cleared of unexploded ordnance and was not yet accepting returnees. They shook hands. These two men who had shared a barracks for nearly a year, who had talked through countless nights about philosophy and politics and the nature of the war they had fought. "Remember what we learned here," Weber said. "Not just the comfort and the food, but the ideas. Democracy isn't weakness. Treating enemies humanely isn't naive. These things we thought were soft are actually what make a society strong." Hartman nodded. "I'll remember. But I don't know if it will matter. Germany is destroyed. What we build from the ruins might not be our choice to make." "Then we'll have to fight for it," Weber replied. "Not with guns this time, but with words and votes and persistence. If we don't, everything we suffered was for nothing." The journey back to Germany was long and uncomfortable, a stark contrast to the relative ease of life in the camp. They sailed from New York on a crowded troop transport, hundreds of prisoners packed into holds that had once carried American soldiers toward the war. The food was adequate but not abundant. The accommodations were cramped. It was as if they were being gradually reintroduced to hardship, prepared for what awaited them. When they landed at Bremerhaven in March 1946, the scale of destruction became immediately visible. The port city was a wasteland of rubble and twisted metal. Buildings that had once housed families and businesses were now hollow shells. The population moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and ragged, searching for food or fuel or any material that could be salvaged and traded. Hartman was processed through a British debriefing center, where officers asked perfunctory questions about his service, his political affiliations, his knowledge of war crimes. He answered truthfully, revealed nothing that would incriminate anyone, and was released with travel papers and enough ration coupons to last a week. From there, he made his way by foot and by hitched rides on Allied trucks toward his hometown in Lower Saxony. The journey took 5 days. Every mile revealed more devastation. Villages that had stood for centuries were gone, erased by bombs or battles. Fields that should have been planted lay fallow because there were no men to work them and no seed to plant. Refugees clogged the roads, displaced persons looking for homes that no longer existed, families searching for relatives who might be dead. When Hartman finally reached his hometown, he found that his family's apartment building had survived, though the structure was damaged and half empty. His mother was alive, though she had aged decades in the years since he had last seen her. His sister had died in a bombing raid in 1944. The news hit him like a physical blow. He had spent a year living in comfort in America while his sister was being killed by American bombs. The irony was crushing. His mother held him while he wept, this soldier who had seen men die in the desert, who had survived battles and capture and the dissolution of everything he had once believed. "You're alive," she whispered. "That's all that matters now. You're alive and you're home." But what was home? The apartment was freezing because coal was scarce. Food was rationed and insufficient. Electricity was unreliable. The entire city was like a corpse that hadn't yet realized it was dead. And everywhere, the presence of occupation forces, British soldiers who treated Germans with a distant professionalism that was neither kind nor cruel, simply indifferent. Hartman found work clearing rubble, the same job that thousands of former soldiers now performed, breaking apart the ruins of their own cities brick by brick. The work was backbreaking and paid almost nothing, but it was work. As he labored through the spring and summer of 1946, he thought often about Camp Concordia, about the abundance and comfort and strange kindness he had experienced there. It felt like a dream now, something that couldn't have been real. But he knew it was real. The weight he had gained was slowly disappearing as German rations proved inadequate, but the memories remained sharp and clear. The taste of apple pie, the sound of Mozart played on a summer evening, the casual friendliness of American guards who treated enemies as human beings. These memories became a kind of touchstone, proof that another way of living was possible, that societies didn't have to be built on cruelty and domination. He attended political meetings organized by the occupation authorities, forums where Germans were supposed to learn about democracy and rebuild their civic institutions. Many attendees were skeptical, seeing it as victor's justice dressed up as education. But Hartman listened differently. He recognized the ideas being presented because he had read about them in the library at Camp Concordia, had discussed them with Weber and others who had dared to question what they had been taught. When someone in the audience complained that democracy was weak and that Germany needed strong leadership to recover, Hartman surprised himself by speaking up. "I've seen democracy," he said. "I lived in a democratic country for a year as a prisoner. They were strong enough to defeat us, strong enough to occupy half the world, and yet they treated their enemies with more humanity than we showed to our own people. That's not weakness. That's strength we never understood." The room went silent. Some glared at him with open hostility. Others nodded thoughtfully. The British officer conducting the meeting looked at him with interest and asked to speak with him afterward. That conversation led to Hartman being employed as a translator and cultural liaison, helping the occupation forces communicate with local populations. It was better work than clearing rubble, and it put him in a position to help shape the reconstruction. Weber eventually returned to Hamburg and resumed teaching, but with a new curriculum and new purpose. He taught his students about the dangers of propaganda, the importance of critical thinking, the value of democratic institutions. Many parents complained that he was corrupting their children with foreign ideas, but Weber persisted, knowing that Germany's future depended on raising a generation that questioned authority rather than blindly following it. The two men corresponded regularly over the years, sharing observations about Germany's slow recovery and the political developments that were reshaping their country. They wrote about the currency reform that stabilized the economy, about the Marshall Plan that provided aid for reconstruction, about the creation of the Federal Republic and the basic law that would govern it. They wrote about the tensions with the Soviet zone in the East, about friends who had returned to areas now under communist control and disappeared into the Gulag. And they wrote about America, that strange land where they had been prisoners, that place of abundance and contradictions that had treated them better than their own government ever had. They wrote about the impact that experience had on their understanding of the world, how it had shattered their assumptions and forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had defended and the war they had fought. Other prisoners had similar experiences, though each man's journey was unique. Some returned to Germany and immediately fell back into old patterns, blaming the Allies for Germany's destruction and nursing grievances that would poison politics for decades. Others, like Hartman and Weber, tried to build something new, to create a Germany that learned from its catastrophic errors rather than repeating them. The prisoner of war experience in America was not uniform. Some camps were harsher than others. Some prisoners faced discrimination or hostility, particularly after newsreels of concentration camps circulated. There were incidents of violence, escapes that ended in shootings, labor that crossed the line into exploitation. America was not perfect, and the treatment of German POWs was not universally kind. But for hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, imprisonment in America was a transformative experience that challenged everything they had been taught about the world. They had expected brutality and found humanity. They had expected deprivation and found abundance. They had expected hatred and found, if not friendship, at least a willingness to see them as human beings rather than monsters. This experience had ripple effects that extended far beyond individual prisoners. When they returned to Germany, they carried with them stories that contradicted the propaganda they had been fed. They described a country where ordinary people lived in comfort, where resources were abundant, where democracy functioned without descending into chaos. These stories spread through communities, influencing how Germans thought about their own reconstruction and the political systems that might govern their future. The contrast between American treatment of German POWs and Soviet treatment was particularly stark. Prisoners who had been held by the Soviets returned, when they returned at all, as broken men, traumatized by years of forced labor, starvation, and brutality. The stories they told were nightmares. Compared to that, American captivity seemed not just humane but almost utopian. This comparison shaped Cold War politics in Germany, influencing which side many Germans chose to align with and how they understood the ideological conflict that was developing. By the 1950s, West Germany was experiencing an economic miracle, rebuilding with astonishing speed and creating a prosperous, democratic society that would have seemed impossible in 1945. Many factors contributed to this recovery: Marshall Plan aid, currency reform, advantageous trade agreements. But also important was a cultural shift among a generation that had experienced both the horror of totalitarianism and the possibility of something different. The prisoners who returned from America were part of that shift, carriers of ideas and experiences that helped Germany reimagine itself. Hartman married in 1951, a woman who had survived the war working in a munitions factory and who had her own stories of disillusionment with the Nazi regime. They had 3 children and raised them in a Germany that was almost unrecognizable from the country of their youth. There were no more military parades, no more glorification of war, no more worship of the Führer. Instead, there was democracy, prosperity, and a determination never to repeat the mistakes that had led to catastrophe. He never forgot his year in Camp Concordia, sometimes eating dinner with his family in their comfortable apartment in a rebuilt city. He would think about those first meals in the barracks, the roasted chicken, the mashed potatoes, the apple pie. He would remember the shock of that abundance, the cognitive dissonance of being treated well by enemies, the slow realization that everything he had been taught was a lie. His children grew up hearing stories about the war, but not the stories of heroism and sacrifice that had been common in his generation. Instead, he told them about defeat and imprisonment, about learning that the enemy was human, about discovering that democracy and kindness were strengths, not weaknesses. He told them about a camp in Kansas where German prisoners lived better than German soldiers, and what that said about the societies they had been fighting for and against. When Weber died in 1979, Hartman traveled to Hamburg for the funeral. The eulogy, delivered by a former student, described Weber as a teacher who had shown his students that education was about more than facts, that it was about developing the critical thinking necessary to resist propaganda and defend democracy. The church was full of people whose lives Weber had influenced, people who had learned to question authority because he had taught them that blind obedience led to catastrophe. At the reception after the service, an elderly man approached Hartman. He introduced himself as another former prisoner from Camp Concordia, someone who had been in a different barracks, but who remembered seeing Hartman around the camp. They talked for hours, comparing memories, marveling at how much their lives had been shaped by that experience. The man had become a journalist, dedicating his career to exposing corruption and holding power accountable because he had learned in America that such accountability was possible and necessary. "Do you think it made a difference?" the man asked. "All those prisoners who came back with stories about American democracy and kindness? Did it change anything?" Hartman thought about the question. "It changed us," he said finally. "And we changed the people around us, and they changed others. Was it enough? I don't know. Germany today is a democracy, and that's not nothing. But there are still people who long for the old certainties, who blame others for our problems, who want simple answers to complex questions. The fight isn't over. Maybe it's never over." As Hartman grew older, he participated in programs that brought together former soldiers from different sides of the war. These meetings were often tense, filled with unresolved grief and anger, but they were also necessary, a way of acknowledging shared humanity even across the vast divide of war. He met American veterans who had fought in Europe, men who had seen their friends die at German hands. The conversations were difficult, but they were honest, and sometimes they led to understanding, if not quite forgiveness. One American veteran, a man named Robert Jensen who had been at Normandy and survived the Battle of the Bulge, asked Hartman, "Did you know about the camps, about the murders, about what was being done in the name of your country?" Hartman didn't lie. Some of us knew something, though not the full extent. Most of us didn't want to know. We told ourselves it was exaggeration, enemy propaganda. We focused on our own survival and convinced ourselves that we were just soldiers following orders. It was cowardice dressed up as duty. Jensen nodded slowly. "I killed men who probably felt the same way you did. Young conscripts who didn't choose the war, but fought in it anyway. I've had to live with that." "We all have to live with what we did," Hartman replied, "or what we failed to do. That's the burden of surviving. They shook hands, these two old men who had been on opposite sides of history, and in that gesture was a recognition that healing required confronting truth rather than burying it. In 1985, Hartman received an unexpected letter from the United States. It was from Arthur Green, the furniture factory owner who had employed him 40 years earlier. Green, now in his 80s and in failing health, had tracked down Hartman's address through military records and wanted to reconnect. The letter was warm and nostalgic, recalling the days when young German prisoners had learned woodworking in his Kansas factory. Green mentioned that he still had a small chest of drawers that Hartman had built, a piece he had kept all these years because it represented something hopeful in a dark time, proof that enemies could become colleagues, that hatred could be overcome by shared work and mutual respect. Hartman wrote back immediately, and they exchanged several letters before Green died that winter. But those letters meant everything to Hartman. They were confirmation that he had not imagined kindness, that the experience had been real and had mattered to both sides. Green's family later sent him photographs from that period, including one of Hartman standing in the factory workshop, surrounded by the tools of his trade, looking impossibly young and thin but smiling. He barely recognized himself in that image, not just because of the years that had passed, but because the person in that photograph still carried the weight of Nazi indoctrination, still viewed the world through a distorted lens that would take years to correct. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was profoundly emotional for Hartman and his generation. Many of their former comrades had ended up in the Soviet zone after the war and had lived under communist dictatorship for 4 decades. Some had been imprisoned as political dissidents. Others had conformed, finding ways to survive in a system that was different in character but similar in its totalitarian control to what they had known under Hitler. The reunification that followed was joyful but also complicated, revealing how differently the two Germanys had processed their shared history. East Germans had been taught that fascism was a product of capitalism and that by embracing communism, they had cleansed themselves of Nazi guilt. West Germans, by contrast, had undergone a slower and more painful process of confronting their history, of acknowledging collective responsibility, of teaching each generation about the Holocaust and the horrors committed in their nation's name. These different approaches had created different societies, and merging them required navigating difficult conversations about memory, guilt, and responsibility. Hartman, now in his late 60s, found himself drawn into these conversations. He spoke at schools about his experiences, trying to convey to young people what it meant to live in a totalitarian society, how propaganda warped perception, how ordinary people could be led to commit or ignore atrocities. He talked about his time in Camp Concordia not as a story of American virtue, but as an illustration of what happens when societies are built on fundamentally different values. One system based on dominance and racial hierarchy, another based on democratic principles and human rights, however imperfectly realized. The students he spoke to, born decades after the war into a prosperous, democratic Germany, sometimes struggled to understand how an entire nation could have fallen under Hitler's spell. They asked questions that had no simple answers. Why didn't you resist? How could you not know? What would you have done differently? Hartman tried to answer honestly, explaining that resistance was dangerous, that information was controlled, that the psychology of conformity was powerful. But he also insisted that these were not excuses, that individuals bore responsibility for their choices even when those choices were constrained by circumstance. The most important thing I learned, he would tell them, was in America as a prisoner. I learned that everything I had been taught about democracy being weak, about other races being inferior, about Germany having some special destiny, all of it was lies. But I learned it too late, after I had already fought in a war that killed millions. You have the advantage of learning these lessons without paying that price. Don't waste that advantage. Question authority. Demand truth. And never let anyone convince you that some people are less human than others. These talks exhausted him, emotionally more than physically. Reliving those years meant confronting choices he wished he had made differently, acknowledging complicity in a system that had committed genocide. But he forced himself to continue because he believed that testimony from his generation was essential. The last witnesses to these events would soon be gone, and he wanted to ensure that the lesson survived. In the 1990s, as Germany continued its transformation into a fully modern, multicultural democracy, Hartman saw echoes of old dangers. Right-wing extremism was rising in some areas, particularly in the former East, where economic difficulties and social dislocation created fertile ground for nationalist rhetoric. Young people who had never known war were being radicalized by the same kinds of hate-filled ideologies that had destroyed his generation. He found it both terrifying and grimly familiar. He joined counter-extremism organizations, using his story as a cautionary tale. He confronted neo-Nazis at public events, calling them out as ignorant children playing with fire they couldn't understand. He was threatened, called a traitor, dismissed as a senile old man. But he persisted, driven by the knowledge that silence had enabled catastrophe before and could do so again. One confrontation, at a town hall meeting where neo-Nazis were trying to disrupt proceedings, became particularly heated. A young man, perhaps 20 years old, wearing a jacket covered in fascist symbols, shouted at Hartman, "You betrayed the fatherland. You let them brainwash you with American propaganda." Hartman, leaning heavily on a cane, stood and faced the young man. "I fought for the fatherland," he said quietly. "I watched friends die for it. I lived through its defeat and helped rebuild it from ruins. What have you done except wear symbols you don't understand and repeat slogans that brought nothing but death? I spent a year as a prisoner in America, and they treated me better than our own government treated us. That's not propaganda. That's historical fact. And if you think the Nazi ideology was anything but poison, then you've learned nothing from history." The young man had no answer. He left, and while Hartman didn't flatter himself that he had changed the man's mind, others in the room, including several young people who had been listening, came up afterward to thank him for speaking. One teenager said simply, "My grandfather won't talk about the war. Thank you for being willing to tell the truth." As the millennium approached, Hartman's health began to fail. He had lived longer than most men of his generation, long enough to see Germany reunited, prosperous, and democratic, long enough to see the European Union develop, binding former enemies together in economic and political cooperation that would have seemed impossible in 1945, long enough to see his grandchildren grow up in a world where the idea of Germans and French killing each other was not just unthinkable, but almost incomprehensible. On a spring day in 1998, he received a visit from a historian researching American POW camps during World War II. The young woman, a doctoral student from the University of Munich, wanted to interview him about his experiences at Camp Concordia. They talked for hours, with Hartman providing details he had never fully articulated before: the specific layout of the camp, the names of guards and fellow prisoners he could still remember, the work assignments, the food, the cultural programs, the complex emotions of living comfortably while Germany burned. The historian asked him the question that he had been asked countless times. Looking back, how do you reconcile being treated humanely by the people whose country you had been trying to destroy? Hartman was silent for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "You can't reconcile it," he said finally. "That's the point. The irreconcilability of it forces you to confront what your society was and what it could have been. We were told that showing mercy to enemies was weakness, that only the strong survived, that might made right. And then we were defeated by people who were strong enough to show mercy, wealthy enough to share their abundance, confident enough in their values to treat prisoners with dignity. That contradiction broke something in us. Broke it open, like breaking open a shell to let light in." He paused, looking out the window at his garden, at the peaceful German suburb where children played in yards and people went about their lives without fear. "I think about those meals in the barracks," he continued. "That first dinner, with the chicken and the pie. I've never forgotten the taste of that pie. But more than that, I've never forgotten what it represented. It represented a society so secure in itself that it could afford to feed its enemies. And I realized that the war was already lost, not just militarily but philosophically. Everything we had been fighting for was proven wrong by that plate of food." The historian asked if he had any regrets. Hartman laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "My whole life is regrets. I regret joining the army, though I'm not sure I had a choice. I regret not questioning what we were told, though questioning could have gotten me killed. I regret every shot I fired, every order I followed, every day I spent as a willing participant in that system. But I also know that regret without action is just self-pity. So I've tried to use my regret as fuel, to push for the kind of Germany that won't produce another generation of young men with the same regrets. In 2001, Hartman was invited to participate in a documentary about German POWs in America. The filmmakers wanted to capture testimony from the last surviving prisoners before it was too late. He agreed, though the physical demands of filming were challenging for a man now in his late 70s. The documentary featured him alongside other former prisoners, each telling their own version of the same basic story. We expected hell and found something closer to heaven. The film included footage shot at the site of Camp Concordia, which had been dismantled decades earlier, but where foundations and remnants of buildings could still be seen. Walking through that Kansas prairie, even in a wheelchair because he could no longer stand for long periods, Hartman felt overwhelmed by memory. This was where he had discovered that the enemy was human. This was where he had learned to question everything he thought he knew. This was where his real education had begun, decades after his formal schooling had ended. He met with local historians who had preserved records of the camp, who had interviewed American guards and Kansas civilians who remembered the German prisoners working on their farms. These Americans, now elderly themselves, remembered the Germans as hard workers, as polite young men who seemed grateful for the chance to work and to earn something. Some remembered friendships forming, tentative at first, but gradually deepening as language barriers were overcome and common ground was discovered. One woman, whose father had employed German prisoners on his farm, told Hartman, "Daddy said those boys were just like our boys, except they'd been fighting for the wrong side. He said most of them didn't believe in Hitler anymore, if they ever really had. He said they were just trying to survive, same as everyone else." She paused, then added, "He got Christmas cards from a couple of them for years after the war. They never forgot his kindness." Hartman wondered if any of those prisoners had been men he knew, if those Christmas cards had been sent by someone from his barracks or his work details. It was possible. The world was smaller than people realized, and the web of connections from that time extended in countless directions, linking former enemies in bonds formed by shared experience. The documentary aired in 2002 to considerable acclaim in Germany. It sparked renewed interest in the POW experience and led to several academic studies examining the long-term impact of American captivity on German prisoners. Researchers found patterns that Hartman's story exemplified. Prisoners who had been held in America were more likely to support democracy after their return, more likely to participate in civic institutions, more likely to resist extremist politics. The correlation wasn't perfect. Some returned prisoners remained committed Nazis, and some became communists. But the overall trend was clear. Treatment mattered. How prisoners were handled by their captors influenced not just individual lives, but the broader political culture of post-war Germany. This research validated what Hartman had always believed, that his year in Camp Concordia had been more than just a fortunate accident of war. It had been a crucial education in democracy and human rights that shaped the rest of his life. He took satisfaction in knowing that his experience had been part of a larger pattern, that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had received a similar education, and that collectively they had contributed to building a better Germany from the ruins of the old. His wife died in 2003, ending a 52-year marriage that had been the foundation of his post-war life. Her death hit him hard, leaving him adrift in a way he hadn't experienced since the chaos immediately after the war. His children and grandchildren rallied around him, but there was a loneliness that couldn't be filled. He spent long hours sitting in his study, looking at photographs from different eras of his life. A young soldier in Africa, gaunt and frightened. A prisoner in Kansas, beginning to regain health. A young man rebuilding post-war Germany. A middle-aged father with his family. An elderly activist speaking truth to power. Each photograph represented a different version of himself, yet they were all connected by the thread of experience that had shaped him. The soldier became the prisoner. The prisoner became the builder. The builder became the witness. And through it all, the memory of that year in America remained central, the pivot point around which his understanding of the world had rotated. In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the war's end, there were commemorations throughout Germany and Europe. Hartman was invited to numerous events, though his failing health limited his participation. At one ceremony in Berlin, attended by veterans from many nations, he found himself standing beside an American veteran who had fought in the Pacific Theater. They talked, two old men comparing notes on a war that had consumed their youth. The American asked where Hartman had been held as a prisoner. When Hartman mentioned Camp Concordia, the American smiled. "My uncle was a guard at a POW camp in Texas," he said. "He used to tell stories about teaching the German prisoners to play baseball. Said they never really got the hang of it, but they tried." Hartman laughed. "We played baseball at Concordia. You're right, we never understood it. But we appreciated that they tried to include us in their games, in their culture. It was humanizing, which I think was the point." They stood together in silence for a moment, two survivors of a conflict that had killed tens of millions, that had reshaped the world, that had defined their generation. Finally, the American said, "I'm glad you made it through. I'm glad you helped build something better afterward." "I'm glad we all did," Hartman replied, "though too many didn't make it to see what we built." That year, Hartman made one final trip to America. His grandson, who had become a software engineer, lived in California, and Hartman wanted to see him and his new great-grandchildren before his health deteriorated further. The flight was long and exhausting, but arriving in America again after 60 years was profoundly moving. The country had changed enormously: computers, the internet, the sprawling cities, the incredible diversity of the population. But underneath the surface changes, he recognized something familiar: the casual confidence, the openness, the sense of possibility that had struck him even as a prisoner. His grandson drove him through California, showing him the tech companies and universities where innovation flourished. Hartman, who had lived through the evolution from Nazi dictatorship to democracy, from ruins to prosperity, from manual labor to digital technology, marveled at how much could change in a single lifetime. He thought about that frightened young soldier on the ship approaching New York Harbor in 1945, and how impossible all of this would have seemed to him then. They visited a museum dedicated to World War II history, and Hartman found himself standing in front of exhibits about the Pacific War, the Holocaust, the Manhattan Project, the post-war occupation. The complexity of the war, reduced to artifacts and explanatory text, seemed both too much and too little. How could anyone who hadn't lived through it understand what it had meant? How could the magnitude of the suffering and the profundity of the transformation be conveyed to people who had only known peace and prosperity? But then he saw a group of schoolchildren moving through the museum, listening intently to their teacher, asking questions, showing genuine curiosity about this history that shaped their world. And he thought, this is enough. They don't need to understand it the way we did. They need to understand it enough to never repeat it. That's the responsibility of education, to pass on not just facts but wisdom, not just dates but meaning. On his last evening in California, sitting in his grandson's backyard watching the sun set over the Pacific, Hartman felt a deep sense of peace. He had lived through the worst of the 20th century and survived to see some of its better moments. He had been a soldier in an evil cause, a prisoner who learned humanity from his captors, a builder of a new Germany, a witness to history, a teacher of the next generation. His life had been shaped by war, but not defined by it. He had found ways to make meaning from catastrophe, to build something positive from the ruins of his youthful mistakes. He returned to Germany knowing it would be his last international trip. His health continued to decline through 2006 and into 2007. He spent his final months in a care facility, surrounded by family and friends who came to hear his stories one more time. He talked about the war, about imprisonment, about the long work of rebuilding and reconciliation. He talked about the importance of democracy, of human rights, of treating even enemies with dignity. He talked about apple pie in a Kansas barracks and what it had taught him about the kind of society worth building. Klaus Hartman died in September 2007 at the age of 85. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service briefly, but focused primarily on his post-war work, his involvement in Reconstruction, his advocacy for democracy, his decades of speaking to young people about the dangers of totalitarianism. The obituary ended with a quote from an interview he had given years earlier. "I learned more about humanity in 1 year as a prisoner in America than in 20 years as a citizen of Nazi Germany. That taught me that how we treat people, even our enemies, defines who we are more than any ideology or flag ever could." His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, family, friends, former students, activists, historians, and several other elderly men who had been prisoners with him decades earlier. They came to honor a man who had tried, in his own way, to make amends for the mistakes of his youth by dedicating his life to ensuring those mistakes were not repeated. They came to celebrate a life that had been transformed by unexpected kindness and had spent decades trying to pass that kindness forward. Among the mourners was an American, a middle-aged woman who identified herself as the granddaughter of Michael O'Reilly, the guard who had organized baseball games at Camp Concordia. She had found Hartman's name mentioned in her grandfather's journals and had tracked down his family to pay respects. She told Hartman's children that their father had been mentioned by name in those journals, described as one of the good ones, a thoughtful young man who seemed genuinely changed by his time here. The journals, which she had brought with her, offered a guard's perspective on the camp. The mixture of boredom and duty, the gradual humanization of the prisoners as individuals rather than enemies, the satisfaction of watching defeated men regain health and hope. O'Reilly had written extensively about the importance of treating prisoners well, arguing that how America handled its POWs would influence post-war relationships and the kind of world that emerged from the conflict. He had been right, though he had died in 1983 without fully seeing how right he was. The woman donated the journals to a German historical society, where they joined other archival materials documenting the POW experience. These materials would be studied by future historians, by students trying to understand this chapter of history, by people searching for family members who had been prisoners. The story would continue to be told, refined and expanded as new sources emerged, offering ever more nuanced understandings of how enemies became humans, how captivity became education, how war's hatreds could be transformed into peace's possibilities. In the years after Hartman's death, interest in the German POW experience in America continued to grow. More documentaries were made, more books were written, more academic studies were published. The story resonated because it offered a counter-narrative to the usual tales of war. Instead of dehumanization and brutality, humanization and decency. Instead of vengeance, pragmatism mixed with genuine compassion. Instead of permanent enmity, the possibility of reconciliation and transformation. For the generation that had lived through it, men like Hartman and Weber and the hundreds of thousands of others who spent time in American camps, the experience remained complex and multilayered. It was not simply a story of American virtue. The United States had its own profound moral failings during the war, from the internment of Japanese Americans to the maintenance of racial segregation. But for German prisoners specifically, American captivity had offered something unexpected and ultimately transformative. A glimpse of an alternative to totalitarianism, proof that democracy could be strong and successful, evidence that treating people with dignity produced better outcomes than treating them with cruelty. This lesson, learned by force of circumstance rather than choice, had ripple effects that extended far beyond individual prisoners. It influenced how Germany rebuilt itself, how it structured its democracy, how it approached questions of human rights and international cooperation. Not every prisoner learned the lesson, and not every German who learned it was a former POW. But collectively, the experience of those hundreds of thousands of men who passed through American camps contributed to creating a political culture in post-war Germany that was fundamentally different from what had come before. The barracks at Camp Concordia are long gone now, torn down and recycled, the land returned to agriculture. But the memory persists in archives and interviews, in documentaries and books, in the stories passed down through families. The memory of what happened when enemies were treated as human beings, when abundance was shared with those who had nothing, when the defeated were given a chance to see their conquerors not as monsters, but as people. And somewhere in that memory lies a lesson that transcends the specific circumstances of World War II, that how we treat people matters, that small acts of kindness can have profound impacts, that even in the darkest moments of human history, There is space for humanity to assert itself. The German prisoners who walked into American barracks and thought they had been sent to heaven learned this lesson at the most unexpected time in the most unlikely place. And in learning it, they helped create a future that was better than the past they had left behind.